Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the New Renaissance podcast. This will be episode 23. I've got a very special guest today, and we're going to be going through some more stuff to do with performance, which we have done over the last couple of episodes. Sam, who is the guest today, has some unbelievable results when it comes to performance coaching, and today we're going to take a deep dive into that sort of topic so that people can level up their performance in the gym and whatever sport they currently play. But before we get started, Sam, would you like to introduce yourself, what your role is as a coach, who you've coached in the past, and what it is that you do?
Thanks for having me on, Dylan. Yeah, we finally got a date in the diary, didn't we?
Yes.
So, I'll start off with a little bit of information about myself, background, and also the role itself. So, I'm a certified strength and conditioning coach, more so through the UKSCA actually, so it's UKSCA accredited. My background is in strength and conditioning. Performance coach, strength and conditioning coach, kind of falls under the same umbrella. So very much a background in the strength and conditioning side of things. Been doing that for coming on 12 years now, with a background in pro football, which is we'll call it my jam. I've been working in the pro game for coming on a decade now, and was with Crystal Palace up until about 6 years ago. Did a stint there before setting out on my own, jumping the ship as it were. And ever since then, it's just been still obviously continuing with the physical preparation of the athletes that we work with. But my role has kind of changed a little bit as well, because along the way I've built up a team, so it's about managing the team now, but still very much involved in the coaching process. But alongside that, it is managing. We have other S&C coaches, sports scientists, and also performance nutritionists. So it's more about managing a business now than really getting into the weeds of the coaching.
Yeah, 100%. And do you find that, because obviously it was predominantly footballers that you was coaching?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, historically we've predominantly been in football, but we also work with other sports as well. We have a couple of different pathways within the business itself. One is more on the high performance, which is focusing on footballers in Premier League, Championship, Leagues 1, 2, Scottish Prem, Swiss Super League, Ukrainian Premier League. Yeah, so we've got quite a big reach throughout Europe as well. But also, in addition to that, there's a return to play side of things as well. So I've always had a very strong interest and passion in the late stage side of return to play process. And obviously, just the nature of that, we tend to attract other sports and hobbies as well. So, there's two arms to the business when it comes to the remote side of things. It's the football and then also multi-sport. And within the multi-sport category, we have lacrosse, endurance, hockey. We have all of the above. So a bit of a mixed bag there.
Yeah, because a lot of people who are potentially tuning into the podcast, I feel like, are in some form of performance when it comes to the gym. Now, that may be somebody who's just trying to build muscle. That might be someone who's doing the first high rocks, the 10K, 5K, marathon, or it's somebody who's predominantly involved in a sport as well. Would you say there's a massive crossover for most people when it comes to leveling up the performance, that their training may not be suited to what they're currently doing? I think a lot of people just follow like the typical bro split in the gym and then do like 1 or 2 runs on the weekend.
Yeah. The typical weekend warrior approach. Yeah, I would say that typically that approach wouldn't have a lot of carryover towards a particular sport. For sure, there still would be an element of it, right? We're still loading the tissues. There's still an element of force production when it comes to lifting, even if you are doing bro splits. But if you're ultimately trying to improve and optimize all aspects of your performance from a gym perspective, you want to be looking at the full profile. So not only on the strength side of things, also power, speed elements. When we break down, just those 3 physical qualities alone, there's so many different components to that. So on the strength side of it, we obviously got bilateral, unilateral, split loading. How much force you can produce in those positions depends on obviously the position you're in. Then when we look at the more power side of things, how much load we can use, how quickly we can use it or move it, how quickly we can move our own body weight or generally displace our own body weight in different directions. And then when we look at the speed side of things, it's not only talking about the actual acceleration and top speed abilities, if we're talking about out and out linear speed, there's also the multi-directional side of it. So there's a braking element as well. There's a change of direction. And then there's also the mechanical aspect to it as well. Then if we delve a little bit deeper into an additional quality, if we're talking about the high rock slot, there's a massive endurance element to that as well. So then if we're looking at the energy system development demands of that, a bodybuilding program isn't quite going to help you do at Hyrox. So yeah, that's where the specificity lies, and it's the nature of strength and conditioning, isn't it? It's applying the physical and physiological demands specific to obviously the demands of the sport or the hobby that you're trying to do or complete.
Yeah, 100%. What would you say is probably one of the biggest challenges that you face as a coach?
It's a good question. I say I faced a few, but I think, to be honest, I think the biggest challenge I've faced is probably when I was working at Crystal Palace. There were probably a number of occasions, actually, a number of situations. And it was when I was with the first team, just being in a group dynamic with a lot of, big characters. There were a few within the group setting who just made things quite challenging and would openly test and challenge me in front of a group of people, which at the time when you're quite new to it and you're not used to it, can be quite an alarming, sort of daunting situation. But ultimately, they're either trying to get a reaction out of you or just generally just test you / mug you off in front of other people. I would say that's, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the specifics of it and who it was and who's involved, but I'd say that was probably it. It's just being able to deal with a situation like that and deal with it in the right way without reacting, being reactive, and obviously just dealing with it in a professional way, which is what is expected of us as coaches. I've worked with many very severe injuries, and I wouldn't say they are anywhere near as challenging from my side. Obviously, there's the expectation that you have to manage, and obviously a lot of emotion involved in injuries when it comes to working with athletes. But I'd say my experiences at Crystal Palace were probably the most challenging.
Yeah, and was it from Crystal Palace when you made the decision to then go and start your own coaching? How did you find that experience of thinking, right, I've got myself a full-time job here, I'm assuming, and then you're just going to go, right, I'm going to go off and do my own thing? Was that a difficult jump? I know that there's some people potentially listening who's the coach who's worked on the gym floor all their life, then they may be thinking of going online, or somebody who's got a full-time job who's thinking about diving into starting their own business. What was that decision like?
So I actually started out in personal training. So that was my first role within the actual industry itself. So I already had a bit of a business going prior to going on and getting further qualifications and masters, etc. And obviously then getting the job at Crystal Palace. So there was a foundation there. I hadn't moved into the remote space at that point in time. I was on the verge of going into it. But I say alongside my Palace job, I was doing probably an additional 15 hours on the gym floor. I was kind of squeezing them in after hours on weekends when I could. So there was already a little bit there. The brand was already there. I was, certainly in the process of trying to evolve it. So it made the actual jump a lot easier. If I hadn't had anything there, the risk associated with just leaving absolutely everything and working towards a role within professional football, probably wouldn't stack up. But because I had something there and there was a basis to work off, and also some opportunities from networking outside of football, although still within football, but in a different capacity, it made the decision a little bit easier.
Yeah, and there's a quote, I'm not sure if I'm going to get this right, mate, but it's about working on your 5 to 9 as much as your 9 to 5. Sometimes when you're in that position where you're trying to start your own business, of just doing as many hours as you can do and still keeping yourself sound, should we say, so then you can obviously jump ship and go on to the next venture. And it's all a journey at the end of the day. I'm sure you've learned so much that you've carried over into what you do now.
100%. I mean, from my side, I always wanted to be my own boss, and the decision to leave Palace, looking back on it, zero regrets. Everyone still questions it to this day, being like, oh, it even says, would you go back into working within a football club environment? And absolutely not. Just purely based on what I've managed to build outside of it, it would make it very challenging to go back in.
Yeah. And with you working at Palace, was there any time, and I'm sure you probably still get this now with players, where there was issues with fixtures, and I'm sure that's something that probably crops up, like so many fixtures in a week, so many training sessions. Do you find that there's a lot of footballers and athletes who are potentially overtraining, or do you find that there's a lot more that undertrain?
I'd say within a club environment, they're very well managed. From a load management perspective, they're very closely monitored. So if, say, for instance, their acute chronic ratio is in an undesirable position, then their load would then be altered based on what the data is saying. So within a club environment, do I think they're overtrained? No, more often than not. Do I think there's an opportunity to potentially develop the foundation a little bit further at certain points throughout the year? Potentially, just depending on obviously who you're working with, where they are in their long-term athletic development. But I'd say more often than not, no, I wouldn't say they're overtrained. There's an element of, say, risk associated towards the back end of the season when, typically how we look at things is in the normal English leagues, their VO2 max would typically increase throughout the first half of the season and then start to tail off second half of the season when the obviously accumulation of fatigue over a period of time and the lack of time to actually recover adequately starts to creep in. You could then start to argue there's an element of an overtrained state, but it's purely because they're under-recovered. So that's kind of the argument we'd have with that one. Outside of a professional environment, undertrained, sure. Sure. We work with quite a few players in the non-leagues as well as obviously the affiliated leagues. And, they'll train Tuesday, Thursday, play Saturday. There's a huge gap in their general physical development when you're training twice a week and then playing on a weekend. And obviously the associated risk of that as well, just having 2 training sessions. And from my experience, those training sessions can sometimes be quite chunky as well. They probably won't take into consideration that a Thursday is a match day -2. They might still be hitting like 6 to 8K with, up to sort of 800 meters of high-speed running, which is mad. But, this is kind of what you're dealing with, the level of, I'm not going to discredit coaching, probably is an element of the level of coaching involved, but also the consideration around managing load. Also, they need to try and get a substantial hit and also session into them because of the touch points they have throughout the week. So it makes it a little bit harder. But yeah, generally for those guys, undertrained, albeit with big spikes throughout the week.
Yeah, 100%. Because like for myself, when I first started playing, I was at non-league Chorley football club. And I think when you mentioned about the accumulation of fatigue, for me, when I was playing and I was starting out PTing, and obviously I was PTing more general population, transformation-based results, opposed to like the high-performance Premier League footballer. I always told myself I need to be training more because I was still trying to coach these people when I was PTing, but I knew to myself that I needed to do more performance-based training sessions. And I feel like there's a lot of people who are potentially doing the high roxes or potentially non-league or semi-pro who are trying to push to that next level, who feel like they need to do more, but they don't understand that they're also working a 9 to 5. They've got a lot of stress going on at home. They're trying to cram too many sessions in around what they're currently doing. Then they don't understand that phrase, accumulation of fatigue.
The thing is, I mean, if we're exposed to stress all over the place, right? So it's not just physical. It's not just from what we do in the gym, out on the pitch, or, if you're doing your high rocks training, it's not just purely down to that internal load that the body is having to endure. You get stress everywhere, right? There's also environmental. There's whatever goes on at work, whatever goes on at home. It all fills the cup. Your body can't differentiate between what is typical stress from, say, for instance, doing exercise and also what stress from having a barney with your missus. It all fills up and taxes your nervous system in the same manner. So it's also very individual as well. And I've had the conversation so many times with people about what is the right amount to train in a week. I mean, it's so individual. There's no right or wrong answer because in my prime, God, I'm not that old, I used to be able to do 2 or 3 sessions in a day, 5 days a week. Obviously it'd be undulating depending on obviously what we're doing. When I was doing Ironman training, you've got 3 disciplines. You'd sometimes do, 3 sessions in a day. I could do doubles quite consistently, whether it be, heavy lifting, quite high volume, quite high intensity in conjunction with an additional run consistently. But, what works for me doesn't work for you or the person next to me. So it's all about just when it comes to working with someone else, and you'll know this as well from your experience, it's just identifying exactly what's going to be the right fit for them. And, you might not get that right within the first week of training them.
Yeah,
It takes
100%.
time,
And
doesn't it?
do you think
Yeah.
there's those? What are the first warning signs that you'd see potentially with the Premier League player where they are starting to accumulate the fatigue? I know that you mentioned the VO2 max starts to decline. Is there anything else?
Yeah, so there are other markers you can look at, and what we tend to do with our players on a weekly basis is we'll do some form of neuromuscular fatigue screening each week, and this can range from standard counter movement jump to just to have a look at explosive strength and how that quickly or slowly they've recovered, essentially the recovery rate and comparison. And what you do is you compare obviously the data that you have on a weekly basis to the baseline data that you have from them when they're in a slightly more recovered state. So we'd have that. We'd also do, in addition to that, adductor squeeze testing as well. So we'd be looking at the neuromuscular fatigue side of things week on week and how that then can accumulate over time, and look at the deficits week on week. There's also, you can also start to look at the internal load as well. You can look at resting heart rate, HRV, see how that changes over time. I don't know if you tend to monitor that readily. The likes of Whoop nowadays means you can just have access to that data on a daily basis, and you'll see throughout the week, the more you're exposed to stress, the more it's going to influence your resting heart rate and your HRV. So you can use some internal monitoring as well as other metrics for monitoring fatigue. But also, you'd look at the data within games as well. So you'll see that it's not always the case, but can often happen throughout the latter stage of the season. The output on the pitch might not be as high as it was, say, for instance, in the first quarter. We're going to compare it to the first quarter. We're going to compare it to when they're at their fittest, maybe sort of transitioning into that second quarter.
And I know this is kind of a question that ends up being an it depends question for a coach, but do you think that there's a common limitation for like the elite level athlete, whether that's the triathlete, the football player, and the high rocks? Do you think there's one that covers all bases?
Is it too harsh to say access to good quality coaching?
That's a great answer.
Are we talking? So we're talking very general. It could be physical.
Yeah. But I do like how you mentioned the access to quality coaching. I understand what you mean, 100%.
I think if we try and break it down pragmatically, so if we look at the kind of level that someone is aspiring to get to, what is their start point? What is their end point? It's then trying to differentiate what could be some of the challenges and limitations that they have. We can appreciate that limitations could be interpreted as challenges as well. What's going to influence the coaching process or the success of the actual process itself, the outcome? And this is where it's like, it depends, isn't it? Because everyone's different. Everyone has different schedules, different availabilities to train. Some might have a slightly more intense job if we're talking like more of a 9 to 5. Some might struggle to find windows to train throughout the week. You might have someone who then works for themselves, works from home, can get in the gym easily once, sometimes twice a day. So then you're kind of comparing an apple and a pear. So then obviously the outcome from one person to the next, when the lay of the land is this different, is going to be very different. Yeah, so yeah, bit of a wishy-washy way of saying it depends.
And the most educated it depends I've ever heard, mate. But I love it. What would you say is the biggest physical limitation then for like the athlete, like the thing that you feel like always holds people back, or what people could work on more?
I think a lot of this stems from the youth. So depending on who we're talking about here and their training environment, what they have access to, is going to heavily influence, firstly, their development and also how things can pan out over time. Some people naturally, just the way in which they are made up, their anatomical makeup can sometimes mean they're more susceptible to injury anyway. And there's a lot of literature in that when it comes to not only ACL injuries, but also hip pathology, associated risk with adductor injuries, also meniscus injuries. If we're talking about just general non-contact accumulation injuries to whatever part of the body it is and the tissue associated with it. There is a lot of literature in that. So some will fit into that pool of being slightly more susceptible. Therefore, that obviously then creates one of the biggest physical limitations they're ever going to have, because they might end up getting stuck in this vicious injury cycle. And yeah, I mean, I'm kind of referring what I've just said here to contact injuries, which have happened quite recently in the game. Two players retiring at the age of 19. No, one's 19 and one's 21, very recently, due to ACL injuries.
Yeah, the ACL injury is a common one, isn't it? What's the main things people could potentially put into now for them to prevent that from happening in the future? Obviously, despite the potential anatomical disadvantage that they might be at.
So when it comes to trying to understand the mechanisms of these two injuries, we kind of categorize them into contact and non-contact. Non-contact ACLs, for me, are always a bit of a concern. And whenever I take someone on board and we go through the mechanisms of it in detail, it becomes quite clear on potentially where they've become unstuck, and also the frailties in their system. And I refer to their system as a whole because it is very general. You know, their system could be the way in which they move, the strategies they implement when it comes to certain situations. It could also be the decision making. So if we look at those three areas, if we look at the way they move, so one of the biggest ways in which non-contact injuries tend to come about is from some form of deceleration into a change of direction. So does an athlete have the ability to be able to control speed? Can they decelerate correctly? Do they have the strength to be able to tolerate the force? Are they then able to put their limb in a position whereby it's then deemed safe to not put that joint in a vulnerable position? So there's a number of different areas we'd look at there. I'm afraid on the contact side of things, more often than not, it's unavoidable.
Yeah. I'm not 100% sure, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, mate, openly. Yeah. I did a literature review when I was at university on injuries in footballers that was non-contact, I think, and it was related to the majority of them did come from weakness in the hamstrings. And I always find that there's a lot of clients who I've had who've come and called, and then you get checking photos, and they always seem to have some form of pelvic tilt, and they always seem to have some form of lower back and hip flexor issue. Would there be a reason for that?
Yeah, so you're spot on. Hamstrings are the numero uno, closely followed by adductor and calf. I can't remember the exact order to that one. They're both, they're all pulled in the same category as the common injuries within the sport. Now, hamstring injuries that come about a number of different ways. There is sometimes just general deficiency or discrepancy between, say, for instance, one and the other, and also just general force production of the actual muscle itself. Often, though, if you're referring to someone who has, say, for instance, an APT like you've referenced, and they're putting out really high eccentric strength scores on the Nord board, they still can be susceptible. I'm going to say can because it's not as black and white as being like, if you've got APT, you're going to get injured. Because sometimes, and a lot of the times, you'll have an athlete who can tilt the pelvis well, and this is where it's quite important. If you've got good, say for instance, if you do have an anterior pelvic tilt, but you still have good motion through the pelvis, even with an APT, then sometimes it can be deemed to be a little bit safer than someone who is just has very little or limited motion of APT, but then tries to go through a high velocity action such as a sprint. Because if the pelvis gets stuck in that position, and then when you start to get into that late swing phase of, say, for instance, an acceleration, you've got the hamstrings extending over both joints. The tissue is naturally in an elongated position anyway because of the orientation of the pelvis, and then the hamstring gets put in a very vulnerable position. So that's typically how the injuries tend to manifest from, say, for instance, someone who has an orientation of the pelvis in that particular position.
And what would be the first things you'd be saying to that person to work on straight in the gym?
So typically when the pelvis is in that position, you have lengthening over the hamstring itself. So the actual tissue is at a lengthened state when at rest, or even in a, say, for instance, whatever. We call rest like a standing position. Also then shortening front side as well. So the hip flexors is then in a shortened position, posteriorly in a lengthened position. So ultimately what we're trying to do is bring a little bit more centration to the actual pelvis itself. There's a number of different ways in which you can do this. You can do slightly more static protocols to help lengthen, but then we also need to focus on the strengthening element as well, front side, and then also the rest of the body as a whole. So how is the actual structure of the trunk going to help support the pelvis below when it comes to isolated and also integrated movements? And yeah, we use a number of different mechanisms to help with that when it comes to ensuring that the trunk is doing its job to help stabilize the pelvis below, and so that the pelvis isn't slipping in and out too much.
Yeah, well, and then would that potentially go from, I'm assuming you're referencing to some sort of core work there as well. Would that potentially then go from, if someone's covering from that injury, would they then start to introduce some sort of movements where they can then go back to sprinting?
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you're going to have a very sort of holistic and rounded approach to it, there would be a lot of emphasis on trying to correct the orientational position of the pelvis. Then when it comes to starting to add in, say for instance, dynamic movements, it could be you could start off with something super simple, getting the athlete to go from extended position backside to a flex position front side, and then going up into a hip lock position. Essentially, you're still getting the athlete going from hip flexion into extension, and then holding it in a hip lock position. So you're having a look at how the body is then tolerating going from flexion into extension, and the trunk, how that's then contributing towards the movement itself. So you can do a lot of isolated trunk work. It's certainly beneficial as well, but I do like to focus on trying to get integrated as well, and then adding more dynamic explosive movements, whether it be jumps and plyometrics in isolation, or then starting to integrate it into more of an action such as sprinting.
Yeah, and obviously that's more specific to the sport.
Yeah, definitely. But
ultimately,
ultimately,
with the plyometric you just mentioned, what is the reasoning behind the plyometric training? I feel like I know myself, but I just want you to explain for the listener. And what are the benefits that players will see from it?
So with jumps and plyometrics, I always see this as, I like to deem it the sexiest stuff when it comes to training, and also sometimes like the untapped resource. I find a lot of players that we've worked with in the past are underdeveloped in this department purely because of the exposure they've had or lack of exposure. Often the exposure they've had is very rudimentary and entry level, and when it comes to really trying to develop that top of the pyramid of an athlete's development, this is where you can see great gains in the power and the speed side of things. So plyometrics are implemented to help on the power side of things, and when it comes to developing power, we look at 3 different ways of doing it. I'll tell you my 2 favorite and then my least favorite, but still seems to be very common within the sport. Moving a heavy load, heavy to moderate load, as fast as possible or with intent. So therefore we're getting the force requirement, but also with the velocity, which is going to help us give us a good peak power output. And then also the jumps and the plyometrics. So utilizing your body weight, displacing the body weight in certain vectors, whether it be vertical, horizontal, or lateral. Those are my 2 favorite. The least favorite is a loaded jump. I'm not going to diss on it too much. It still has value, but when it comes to the actual power profile that we're trying to seek, jumps and plyometrics with the body weight in conjunction with moving a heavy load as fast as possible are the go-to for me. So you've got the power side of things, and then you've also got the speed. So if we look further up the force velocity curve, where we have, say for instance, lower force but higher velocity movements, such as body weight movements, jumps and plyometrics. We utilize them to develop explosive strength. Explosive strength, fundamental for getting someone to operate better vertically, horizontally, or laterally. And then also on the reactive strength side of things. So getting them better at being able to absorb and utilize energy. And that's where we tend to incorporate things like pogo jumps, where we're trying to get an athlete to be fast off the floor, trying to get a short ground contact time and also a good rebound height. That's essentially the calculation for getting a good reactive strength score. So they're both integral for developing the power and the speed side of things in an athlete.
Yeah, and I was going to delve into the next question of how do you manage the gain for strength, but also the gain for speed in an athlete. And I feel like you maybe answered it there yourself, but maybe
Hmm.
across the week of a player who might have a game on a Sunday,
Hmm.
how is that training split looking? And again, I know it's a depends question, and they've obviously got the training sessions with the team, but
Hmm.
what sort of sessions are you putting in place? Because obviously you're not going to throw a plyometric session at the end of, I don't know, a full 90-minute game sort of thing.
Yeah, spot on. So a lot of it comes down to how many minutes they're playing. So if you've got a player who has say a player's played 90 minutes, match day plus one is typically recovery session. Match day plus two would then be a consideration around re-implementing some. We like to implement some tissue capacity work to help with the recovery process. So we might implement some isometrics in conjunction with upper specifics and also core. So you still get a window for some beneficial loading, which is going to help with the recovery process, but also with the grand scheme of things, helping prepare the athlete for essentially what's going to be match day plus three, which is typically where they'll have the heaviest session on the pitch, and they'll have the most intensity typically in the gym. So Tuesday, it's the furthest away from both points. That's where we'll probably get the majority of our strength work in the week, as well as some additional robustness work. Then when
And
we
when you're
get
referring to match day plus one, sorry, match day plus two, plus three, are
yeah
those the
yeah
sessions on top of the match day?
yes exactly yeah. So we all of our periodization is pretty much it's based off when the game is on the Saturday, and then the week essentially starts. But um,
Yeah.
yeah, so if referring back to what I was saying, so then when you get closer towards the game on the following Saturday, Thursday session would typically then be more power and speed related. So you're still tapping into some good force requirements, but it's more velocity that we're trying to seek here, and less metabolic essentially stress on the tissue itself, which when it comes to obviously preparing someone for a game on a Saturday is going to be preferential as opposed to doing it the other way around. So you get a better window by doing it, in theory, this is the strength work at the furthest point from both games. And then you have a nice little window still to just get some or dose some work in on match day minus two. And then you're going into Friday, and Friday would be very, very heavily stripped back, both on the pitch. Could be some more tactical based work on the pitch, and then might still do some priming work. We sometimes do priming work with players. Some clubs do as well, but depends on what you have access to and who you're working with as well. I think that's quite an important part of it, especially if you're in the private space.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's so crazy to see, obviously, yourself as a coach now going through that of with a football player in season, it's almost like they're running a peak week every week. There's a game every Saturday, there's a game every
Mm.
Saturday. So it's constantly being able to manage playing the best on that Saturday, but also trying to progress, say, the session they're doing on a Monday, session that they're doing on the
Mhm.
Thursday that you managed to do at the plyometric speed, and then the strength sort of thing. So do you find that difficult, or is that something that comes with managing the load as much as you want to push the player on as well?
I wouldn't necessarily say I find it difficult. A 2 game week for sure is a very different dynamic, because if you've got a starting 11 player and they're going from Saturday to Tuesday or Saturday to Wednesday, from a S&C perspective, time in the gym is going to be few and far between. You might still get an opportunity on the Thursday to dose something in, some isometric based movements, maybe even something light on the Monday as well, isometric based. But you're going to struggle to get any eccentric work through a player on a 2 game week. So the dynamic obviously changes massively from a 1 game week to a 2 game week, um, and often that can be the case at this time of the year. We can flip from a 1 game week to a 2 game week. We can have 2 game weeks consistently off the bat. So yeah, it depends once again on who we're working with. But no, I wouldn't say necessarily if we're talking a traditional model of a 1 game week. Pretty straightforward when it comes to the framework that we use. We have the framework as to when we're going to do what, depending on what part of the force velocity curve we're trying to target. And then we just utilize subjective and also objective markers to get an understanding of how a player is presenting and whether we feel they're going to be able to tolerate the load that we're about to give them.
Yeah.
So when it comes to working in the remote space, communication is really important. both on coaching and player side. Takes two to tango, right?
Yeah, 100%. I would say it's 100% when it's coach and client, 50% from the coach, 50% from the client, and you both have to give that whole 50%, or else obviously you find that most of the time that it doesn't work. With the player in the season, what are the best ways that they can recover, or what have you found the best ways for athletes to recover when they're obviously on the go all the time with game after game after
Mhm.
game and so training sessions?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's such a big topic, and also some areas of it I think are massively undervalued. So when we talk about recovery with our players, we have three essentially key pillars that we try and address, and we kind of use them as the bigger rocks. Once we've addressed them, then we can talk about the sort of slightly more acute or smaller grains of sand, which are going to help adorn the process. First and foremost, sleep. I don't think, we don't need to sit here and be like, sleep is important, right? Because everyone knows it. Sometimes it's the application of it that can sometimes go a little bit awry. And what I mean by that is we work with a lot of young athletes. They can sometimes stay up a bit later gaming. They just don't understand maybe the repercussions of losing the sleep, and also how that can accumulate throughout the week, and also how that can impact performance, even on a very acute level. So sleep, fundamental. What do we try and recommend for athletes? I mean, for me, if you can get closer to 9 hours, I'm happy. like it's not always the case of the more the merrier, is it? Because we know the quality of it is important as well. But when you've got, even whether it's a younger or an older player, regardless of where they are in their development, getting, say between 7 and 8 hours kip a night is super important. So we have the sleep side of things. I'm also a big advocate of just general passive rest as well. So just if you're, say for instance, if you get home after a training session, just chilling. I've got nothing against chilling, low stimulation, perhaps not gaming, perhaps not with the TV, maybe a bit of reading, or just closing your eyes for half an hour. It all helps in the grand scheme of things. It all helps give your body and nervous system a little bit of a break from what it's having to endure. And it all adds up over the course of 7, 14, 21 days. So we have sleep, passive rest, and then nutrition, obviously huge. When it comes to nutrition, we actually, and this is something me and my performance nutritionist, we talk about quite often with the players, when it comes to doing a consult with them and trying to understand how they fuel, if you fuel correctly, you'll recover quicker. Okay, so if you're actually getting the right amount of carbohydrates in your body, whether it's 6 grams per kilo of body weight the day before a game, if you start considering that, and also what the day before that might look like, so you've got a 48-hour build up into a game, and you fuel correctly going in, you come out the other end in a more recovered state than you would if you underfueled. So if we're talking percentages, we're trying to get percentages from the fueling strategy, and then also then what the recovery strategy looks like. And when it comes to the recovery strategy with nutrition, what are we talking about here? We're talking about still getting obviously sufficient carbohydrate intake in, protein requirements 1.6 to 2, trying to aim between that sort of range, still getting lots of good fruit and veg in to obviously help not only with the antioxidants but also anti-inflammatory. And then once we've addressed those bigger rocks, we can start to look at some of the other protocols that are still effective, but they're not going to be your savior. So contrast therapy, big advocate of that. Compression garments, BFR, big advocate of that. So there are other things in which you can adorn the process, but if you can't prioritize and obviously nail the strategy around your sleep or nutrition, then spending half an hour in your recovery boots or compression boots is not going to save you.
Yeah, it's the quick fix that everybody's looking for, and the advertisements on Instagram sort of thing. What
psychologically it's pleasing, and it will give you some short-term relief, but when it comes to actually preparing or recovering and preparing correctly for, say for instance, the next session on pitch or in the gym, you're going to fall a little bit short.
Yeah. What does a nutrition day look like for the footballer? How many calories are they on average? Obviously, I know, again, that's an it depends question for the weight and the height of that player. But as an average rule of thumb, I know a lot of people always think that footballers eat way more than what most people think, and they don't understand how they're still in good shape.
Yeah, well, this does depend on the person, right? So when it comes to determining essentially what their intake's going to be, we use the relevant calculations to determine what that would look like based on expenditure. And yes, expenditure does vary throughout the week depending on what club they're at. Not every single week is going to be the same, but we roughly know that there's going to be a degree of periodization on the pitch, depending on whether it's a 1 or 2 game week. And then, we're when it comes to protein intake, we're very consistent on the daily intake there, and we use those ranges just so players don't feel like they are the pressure of. Let's rephrase that. So players don't feel pressurized in order to actually nail that specific number each day, because there is a degree of flexibility when it comes to the requirement there. So giving them a range just gives them a little bit more freedom when it comes to actually hitting that number. The carbohydrate intake will vary throughout the week. And like I said, it will increase throughout the preparation for the game towards the weekend and then back off as they come back out.
And what would that look like? I know that you mentioned potentially, was it 6 grams per kilogram the day before?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we'd look to try and sort of taper the intake, gradually increase it 48 hours pre, and then sustain throughout the weekend and then back off when they come back down towards the start of the week.
Yeah, so you can be getting up to a lot of carbs towards the end of that week on that Friday before the Saturday.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's not all, I'll be brutally honest, it's not all, it doesn't fall under the category of like healthy. But I'd never be the one to sort of pigeonhole foods into good and bad groups. Ultimately your body can't really tell the difference. It turns it all into glucose anyway, and then that obviously then is used as fuel within the muscle itself. And also, if you're going to try and get 6 grams per kilo of body weight via rice, potatoes, you got no chance.
Yeah. I think I've seen as well the carbohydrate gels, most of them are things like fructose and things like that. And they're the sort of compounds that you're going to find in, like, say, your Cocoa Pops or even like your Sour Patch Kids and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, we get players on, what do we give them? We give them pancakes with syrup. We also use juices for the fructose content. It's a very good way of getting a lot of sugar into the body, but also in a liquid format. So in theory, it doesn't really satiate. So it means you can then come back for more a bit quicker. So it's all about just building that bank in preparation for it, if you are going to be starting a 90-minute game of football.
Yeah. Mate, thank you so much. We're going to have to wrap this episode up, but honestly, so much information there for the person who's listened, for me, myself.
I hope they find it. I hope they find it useful.
Yeah, 100%. And for those who are potentially looking out for the coach who's going to help them with their performance, the footballer or the athlete, where would they need to go?
So my Instagram handle is Sam Pepys Performance. That is the best place to get eyes on the content and also how we help players. But also, if you want to have a chat, it's the best place to catch me.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I'll link that in the description below on YouTube and Spotify for those who are watching or listening. Thank you so much, everyone who's tuned in this far. Hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll catch you in the next one.